Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the city, around the state. Welcome to Mr. Moeller's U.S. History. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about the first United States government, kind of part one of talking about how this government gets underway using the Constitution. So for starters, something that probably didn't come through a lot in the last video and a couple of readings is that the Constitution is really a revolution. It completely is a new government, overthrows the Articles of Confederation. It was a small group of delegates elected from each state, kind of did this in secret. And what they're creating is actually a new government. And so before the states are going to go along with this, before the people are going to go along with this, there has to be a vote by the public in order to make it legitimate. And so we call that vote ratification. And so what it means to be ratified is to be voted and approved. And so all of the states, all 13, had to have votes, and if 9 out of 13 accepted the Constitution, it would become the government of the land. So the big debate that everybody was having was this very simple question. Should these states that had had a lot of independence give up that autonomy, that self-rule, to create a new federal government that basically they would have to live under? So there's two sides to this debate, going to be the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists are those who supported the Constitution, people like James Madison, who wrote most of it, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and their big task was really to convince Americans not to be afraid of a large central government because of the American Revolution. Basically, people were very, very skittish about the idea of having a strong kind of government because of Great Britain. But these guys wrote their arguments down. They published them in newspapers called the Federalist Papers, and ultimately they made a few arguments that convinced a number of Americans. One is that the states would actually still have a lot of power in this system, so they didn't need to be afraid of the government the way the colonies had feared Britain. Second was that kind of trade and taxes were different in every state. And so they said in order for us to compete on the international stage, we have to have one voice doing our negotiating. And kind of the last big argument is that as America expands west, what's going to happen with new states, who controls that territory? And so there's a lot of really good reasons why the government should maybe be changed. And so kind of we look at what the states keep, and they kept a lot. Firstly, the states actually picked their senators. You did not used to vote for senator. That's going to change a little bit later in U.S. history. Through the Electoral College, the popular vote doesn't elect the president, the states elect the president. And then finally, in the Constitution, the reserve powers that you guys read about says anything not in the Constitution goes immediately to the states. Things like marriage, driver's licenses. And so the Federalists argue that the states really weren't giving up a lot to get a lot in terms of how this government would support them. But on the other hand, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, these guys oppose the Constitution a lot, and they become known as the Anti-Federalists. And the major issue here is that who is going to have more power? The states or the federal government. And these leaders feared that by giving up their state's control, that they were essentially turning over control to another Great Britain, the same it had been before the Revolution. So they feared a central government. They feared it would oppress the people, it would use its power, it would favor the rich. And so what the Anti-Federalists wanted was actually a Bill of Rights, a list of civil liberties, things the government was not allowed to do to citizens, that would be written into this document. They don't get it at the start, but they eventually get it later. So the ratification vote is going to happen in 1787. And like really through 1790, it takes a couple of years through elections. Technology is not what it is today. The Federalists had promised there would be a Bill of Rights, and the vote was actually closer than people think. If you look at some of these numbers, they're very, very close in a lot of states. But eventually, all 13 agree, and the Constitution happens. And so the first national elections were held from 1788 into 1789. And so that first U.S. government, the first representatives, the first senators, the first president, they all met at the temporary Capitol in New York City. And so you can actually go to New York City now, right on Wall Street. That is where George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. But this new government with George Washington as president is really going to see a lot of problems. After the war, America has a massive debt and overdue payments, which means the United States has terrible credit with banks both inside the United States and banks around the world. So money is kind of the number one issue. Second to that is going to be enforcing the Treaty of Paris. America agreed to do a lot of things with Great Britain, Great Britain citizens, Great Britain assets inside the United States, and a lot of states ignored that. So if you made a deal with someone like this treaty and they went back on it, that's a risky thing. And Britain probably could have, if they wanted to, had justification to restart conflict based on some of these issues. America also started expanding west, and that caused a lot of problems with Native Americans, American Indians. Series of wars are fought in and around kind of Ohio and Illinois. And so that requires national attention. No one state is going to be looking at that. And then finally, like foreign policy, the nations of the world, they don't know the United States. They don't trust the United States. The United States has no track record. And so kind of getting allies and making kind of the world confident that the United States will pay back its debt, live up to its treaties, fulfill its obligations is a very tall order. And the first government is tasked with facing all of it. So George Washington is elected the first president of the United States, and he's the first and only president to be elected without a political party. He's the leader of the revolution. He had been, a hero before that. And so when Washington comes in, kind of he is the person everyone expected to lead. And so he does. And so what he does is he sets up the first cabinet. And the cabinet is going to be the president's series of advisors. You read about that in the textbook. And so he puts in charge some of kind of names you probably know. Thomas Jefferson is put in charge of international relations. Alexander Hamilton is put in charge of all the money with, the Secretary of the Treasury. Henry Knox had been a major general. He's going to be the Secretary of War. Edmund Randolph is a famous lawyer from Virginia, becomes Attorney General. And so their whole point here is that they're advising the government on legal questions, representing the government. When George Washington needs to make a decision, these are going to be the people who are going to sit in the room with him in order to decide what is going to be done. Today, the president's cabinet is way more than a few people. It's huge. It represents millions of employees, and they also have a lot more power today. And so one thing we're going to see is that as time goes forward, the role of the government is going to expand more and more and more because the government's going to face new and bigger challenges. On the other side, the Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court is going to be selected and confirmed. The courts are very weak at first because there's not much in the Constitution about what they're supposed to do. Eventually, their power is going to be judicial review. They're going to be able to interpret the Constitution and decide if a law is unconstitutional or not. But at the start, no one really knew. It wasn't in the Constitution. There was no law. And so there was conflict, like who gets to decide? States, the Supreme Court. And so there's a lot of confusion that'll have to be fixed. And that's a characteristic of this early government. There's a lot of confusions that will eventually need to be fixed. But the Congress, they've set up a court system. It's the one that we still have today with district courts, courts of appeals, and a Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court doesn't really become what it is today until a few years later, in 1803. And there was a case in 1803 called Marbury v. Madison. Don't worry about the details of this. The details will just confuse you. But essentially what happened is that a law that was passed, the Judiciary Act of 1789, went against what was said in the Constitution. So the Supreme Court said, hey, that law, it doesn't match the Constitution, therefore no one has to follow it, and they struck it down and that law went away. That is called judicial review, the power to interpret the meaning of the Constitution and declare laws unconstitutional. And so essentially, if you want to think about this a different way, judicial review is like spot the differences. The Constitution, the law, and if there are too many differences between them, the law gets declared unconstitutional. The best example of this that you guys probably know is Brown versus Board of Education. The Constitution guarantees everyone the equal protection of the laws. But in a lot of U.S. states, segregation in schools was widespread. The Supreme Court looked at segregation, looked at equal, and said these two things do not match, and so they struck down segregation in schools, and eventually segregation is illegal everywhere in the United States. And that's the power of the Supreme Court. They can bring the Constitution to bear on any issue that's facing the country. Then lastly, the Congress. So the first Congress is elected, and the very first laws that they pass is actually the Bill of Rights. Sent out to the states to be approved, you got to change the Constitution, and so that kept a promise. The Anti-Federalists were very skeptical, and so the Federalists basically worked with them to create the Bill of Rights. The second major law that they passed right off the bat was the Tariff of 1789. And if you don't know what a tariff is, it is a tax on trade. It's a tax on things that are going out and they're things that are coming in. And so the tariff of 1789 taxes American trade, making other countries not really want to trade as much with the U.S. So Southern farmers who were growing cotton, tobacco, other things that relied on selling those things overseas, they were hurt by that. And so these are going to be the first signs of the economic conflicts between North and South. Because the government has to tax to make money. It's just the way it is. Governments tax. It's how they get money. So a tariff is a tax on trade, but it makes trade more expensive. And if something's more expensive, you do less of it. And so the reason you do this is that it raises the price on foreign goods. Making foreign goods more expensive than American-made things helps people buy American. But in this time in the South, they're entirely reliant on trade with Britain, with France, with the Netherlands in order to make their money. And so while this tariff raised money for the government and it helped northern manufacturers like producing products, it hurt southern plantation economics. And so these fault lines that are going to start to crack, they're showing up at the very start of the story. But probably the biggest issue facing the government is paying for it all. And America's bankrupt at this time. And so Alexander Hamilton, in charge of the Treasury, comes up with a plan to pay back this debt. First thing he does, he takes all the state debts, all 13 state debts, and he puts them all together and says all this debt belongs to the U.S. government, the national debt. And then in order to pay for that, tariffs and a tax on liquor were put in place, and all the money from that went straight towards the debt. What that meant is now they're paying back some of the money, which means that more people will be willing to lend them money. In order to manage all this, Alexander Hamilton wanted to create a national bank to manage the money of the United States. And they also agreed that they would pay back all the debt at the full value, which means once you pay back money, you have better credit and more people are willing to lend it to you. And so this plan was meant to get the United States back on its feet financially. You guys read about this, so we're going to talk about this in class as well. However, this was problematic across the country. Ordinary people saw this as a betrayal of the American Revolution. We fought against all these taxes by a federal government, and now you are taxing us. And so there was uprisings in the streets. The federal government also is really flexing its power at this point, which frightened the anti-federalists, the states' rights people, because all of a sudden out of nowhere, this government's becoming a lot more wealthy and a lot more powerful. And the National Bank, there was questions about whether or not the government was even allowed to do it, or whether or not it was unconstitutional. So you had a lot of conflicts coming up early on, and especially around the National Bank. It's not in there. If you look anywhere in the Constitution, nothing mentions a bank. And so they had to imply powers to say, well, it's not in there, but we need to make currency, we need to collect taxes, we need to do all this stuff, so it should be implied that we can make a bank. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the reading, but essentially that's how they justified the bank. It's an implied power, but the fight over whether the bank is constitutional or not is not going to go away. It's going to remain well into almost up to the American Civil War. And then the major uprising against these taxes is the Whiskey Rebellion. The tax on whiskey is super unpopular. And so in the West, you have a massive uprising of people who refuse to pay the tax. They're attacking government buildings. And so the U.S. government is met with a very tough decision. This is like the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre. How is the government going to respond to lawbreaking? And so George Washington, knowing it would be controversial, knowing it would be seen as the federal government oppressing the people, ordered the U.S. Army to put down this rebellion. And what this show of force did is it legitimized the government, that it would not accept challenges to its authority, and that it was a legitimate government for the United States. However, a lot of Americans worry that this is the first time, potentially of many, that the federal government will oppress the people. And so the U.S. government will remain very controversial. And so in 1796, George Washington steps aside, having solved some of, but not all of the problems of the nation. And it's fitting to kind of mention that when he steps away, he's the only president who doesn't run with a political party. He also left after 2 terms, which sets a precedent. It's not in law anywhere. It wasn't in law until Franklin Delano Roosevelt that a president couldn't serve as many terms as they wanted. But Washington believed that 2 was enough, and he retired. And so in his last speech, ironically, our founding father warned us about 3 things. He said, whatever you do, don't make political parties because they will corrupt the people. Don't get involved in foreign wars you have no business in because it will compromise your ability to make choices for America. And thirdly, beware of sectionalism. Your fighting between North and South, slave state and free, is going to tear the country apart. And America promptly went out and did all 3 of those things. Immediately, political parties emerged for the next presidential election. The Federalists with Adams and Hamilton, the Democratic Republicans, who were pretty much the anti-Federalists, Jefferson, Madison. And so they're going to continue to fight over all of these issues. The meaning of the Constitution, power of states and federal government, tariffs and taxes, slavery and its spread, the economic future of the United States. And even when the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars happen, Americans are going to be split on that. And so what we have is, from the very start, deep-seated conflicts in America about how to use power are going to exist and continue to cause problems in the future.